"One wrong word to these people and you disappear forever," whispered a fellow server as Sophie entered the most dangerous party in Brooklyn, her uniform pristine, but her hands betraying a slight tremble. The grandest mansion in Brooklyn Heights buzzed with New York's elite criminal underworld, men who could order a hit with a whispered word, and women dripping in diamonds worth more than Sophie's life. Sophie's heartbeat thundered against her ribs as she balanced the silver tray of champagne flutes, making her way through the crowd of designer suits and couture gowns. At 20 years old, this catering gig paid triple her usual diner shifts, money desperately needed for her grandmother's mounting medical bills. Mr. Giordano, the catering manager, had given her strict instructions: serve drinks, remain invisible, and above all, never make eye contact with any of the Cavallari family members. "They're dangerous people," he'd whispered urgently during the staff briefing, his eyes darting nervously around the kitchen. The hushed conversations around her shifted suddenly to respectful silence as an older gentleman entered the ballroom, leaning slightly on an ornate cane with a silver lion's head handle. The Sicilian patriarch had arrived, father to Ethan Cavallari, the infamous 29-year-old who had taken control of the family's business interests with ruthless efficiency. Sophie froze as the older man approached her directly, his weathered face creased in a questioning frown. Her tray trembled dangerously, champagne sloshing against crystal as he gestured impatiently toward her, speaking rapidly, in what appeared to be heavily accented Italian. Without thinking, Sophie responded in flawless Sicilian dialect, the words flowing naturally from memories of her grandmother's kitchen lessons. "Mi scusassi, signor Cavallari, è un onore essere stasera," she said softly, offering him a respectful half-curtsy that nearly upset her tray. The room fell deadly silent, faces turning toward her, with expressions ranging from shock to calculation to outright hostility. She realized her catastrophic mistake instantly. She'd revealed herself as someone who understood their most private conversations, recognized their patriarch, and spoke their ancestral tongue. Mr. Giordano appeared beside her, face ashen, attempting to steer her away. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Cavallari. She's new. She doesn't understand," he began, but the old man silenced him with a single raised finger, studying Sophie with keen interest. "Where did you learn to speak the old dialect, girl?" he asked in accented English, his voice surprisingly gentle despite the intensity of his gaze. "Few Americans, even those with Sicilian heritage, speak it with such authenticity." Before Sophie could formulate a response that wouldn't further endanger her position, a commanding presence materialized at the patriarch's side, Ethan Cavallari himself. Tall and imposing in a perfectly tailored black suit, his reputation for calculated violence preceded him throughout Brooklyn's underworld. "Is there a problem with the staff, father?" Ethan asked, his voice deceptively soft, as his dark gaze swept over Sophie with clinical assessment. Something shifted in his expression when their eyes met, a flicker of interest quickly masked by professional detachment. The patriarch's weathered face broke into an unexpected smile as he switched back to rapid Sicilian dialect, telling his son something that made Ethan's eyebrows rise fractionally. Sophie understood every word, but kept her expression carefully neutral, years of hiding her linguistic abilities surfacing instinctively. "Miss, my father would be honored if you would join our table," Ethan translated unnecessarily, the slight quirk of his mouth suggesting he suspected she understood perfectly. "It seems you've impressed him, which is unusual." Mr. Giordano was signaling frantically from across the room, drawing his finger across his throat in the universal gesture of "stop immediately." But the Cavallaris weren't making a request. They were giving an order disguised as an invitation. "I'm working, sir," Sophie replied carefully, balancing her tray in increasingly sweaty hands. "Your guests need service, and I can't abandon my position without permission from my supervisor." The patriarch laughed, a warm, genuine sound that seemed out of place in the tense atmosphere. He switched to English and addressed the room. "My son hosts this celebration for my 70th birthday. Yet the most authentic gift comes from an unexpected quarter, a simple waitress who speaks our village dialect." Ethan's hand closed gently but firmly around Sophie's elbow, relieving her of the champagne tray with his other hand, and passing it to a nearby server. "Your supervisor works for the catering company, who works for me," he said, his breath warm against her ear as he guided her toward the main table. Sophie felt dozens of calculating stares following her progress across the ballroom, sizing her up as either threat or opportunity. Her simple black uniform stood in stark contrast to the designer evening wear surrounding her, marking her as clearly out of place in this world of power and privilege. The patriarch settled into the seat of honor at the center of the table, gesturing for Sophie to take the empty chair beside him, a place clearly reserved for someone important. "Tell me your name, child, and how a young American girl comes to speak the dialect of my home village so beautifully." "Sophie Bennett, sir," she replied, conscious of Ethan taking the seat on her other side, effectively trapping her between the two most powerful men in the room. "My grandmother raised me after my parents died, and she insisted I learn the old language properly." The patriarch's eyes narrowed with sudden interest, leaning forward to study her face more carefully. "Bennett is not a Sicilian name," he observed, his tone making it clear he expected a more complete explanation. "My grandmother's maiden name was Ferraro, from a small village in the hills above Palermo," Sophie explained, the familiar pain of loss briefly constricting her throat. "She married an American soldier after the war and moved here, but she never forgot her roots." Ethan's posture stiffened beside her, his fingers momentarily tightening around his crystal tumbler of amber liquor. The name Ferraro clearly held significance, though Sophie couldn't fathom why her grandmother's family would be known to these powerful criminals. "Ferraro," the patriarch repeated thoughtfully, exchanging a loaded glance with his son. "Was your grandmother perhaps related to Giovanni Ferraro, who had 3 daughters before the war?" Sophie's heart raced as she nodded slowly, suddenly understanding she had stumbled into something far more complex than a catering job. "He was my great-grandfather, sir," she confirmed, watching recognition bloom across the old man's face. The patriarch switched back to Sicilian dialect, speaking too rapidly for her to follow completely, but she caught fragments about blood debt, honor, and most alarmingly, the missing child. Ethan responded in the same dialect, his voice low and insistent, occasionally glancing at her with unreadable expressions. "It seems we have much to discuss, Sophie Bennett," the patriarch finally said in English, patting her hand with surprising affection. "My son will ensure you're properly compensated for missing your shift tonight." A well-dressed woman at the table leaned forward, her diamonds glittering like ice as she assessed Sophie with open hostility. "How convenient that a Ferraro descendant appears just as we're discussing the Brooklyn Heights expansion," she remarked with poisonous sweetness. Ethan's hand moved to Sophie's back, a subtle but clear gesture of protection that surprised everyone at the table, including Sophie herself. "Careful, Aunt Gina," he said mildly, though the warning in his voice was unmistakable. "We treat guests with respect in this house, especially those with family connections." The night progressed in a blur of introductions and cryptic conversations that danced around subjects Sophie couldn't quite grasp. Through it all, the patriarch kept her close, asking questions about her grandmother, her life, her struggles to pay for college while working multiple jobs. When the party finally began to wind down near midnight, Ethan guided Sophie to the mansion's private garden, away from prying eyes and listening ears. Moonlight silvered the formal hedges and illuminated a spectacular view of the Manhattan skyline across the water. "My father believes your appearance tonight is more than coincidence," Ethan said without preamble, his hands tucked casually in his pockets as he studied her face. "He's a superstitious man who sees signs and omens where others see random chance." Sophie crossed her arms, fighting a shiver that had nothing to do with the cool night air. "And what do you believe, Mr. Cavallari?" she asked, summoning courage she didn't feel. "Because I just came here to serve drinks and earn my pay." A ghost of a smile touched his lips as he shook his head slightly. "I believe in calculated risks and verifiable facts," he replied, stepping closer until she could smell his expensive cologne. "Which is why I had you thoroughly investigated during the party." Sophie's breath caught in her throat, indignation warring with fear. "You had no right," she protested, taking an instinctive step backward. "My life is none of your business, regardless of who my grandmother was. It became my business the moment you spoke to my father in perfect Sicilian dialect," Ethan countered, his voice remaining soft despite the intensity of his gaze. "Few people surprise me, Sophie Bennett, but you've managed it twice tonight." The garden lights illuminated his features, revealing a face too handsome to belong to someone with his reputation. Sophie reminded herself firmly that this man had likely ordered deaths as casually as others ordered coffee, regardless of how those dark eyes seemed to see right through her. "Your grandmother wasn't just any Ferraro," he continued, producing a leather-bound folder from inside his jacket. "Elisabetta Ferraro was promised to my grandfather's brother before the war changed everything. She was considered family." Sophie opened the folder with trembling fingers, gasping at the sepia-toned photograph inside. Her grandmother as a young woman, standing beside a handsome man in military uniform. Her grandmother had never mentioned being engaged before meeting Sophie's grandfather. The war separated them, Ethan explained, his voice unexpectedly gentle as he watched her process this revelation. Your grandmother believed Antonio Cavallari died at Anzio, so she later married your American grandfather when he was stationed in Sicily. The implications crashed over Sophie like a tidal wave, her mind racing to connect fragments of childhood stories her grandmother had shared. The mysterious benefactor who had paid for her grandmother's passage to America, the strange gifts that arrived each Christmas with no return address. But what does this have to do with me? Sophie asked, struggling to understand why these powerful people suddenly cared about her existence. This engagement was broken over 70 years ago. It can't possibly matter now. Ethan's expression darkened as he took back the folder, tucking it carefully inside his jacket. It matters because the Ferraro and Cavallari families swore a blood oath. Our families would one day be united, he said gravely, watching her reaction with unsettling intensity. Moonlight cast dramatic shadows across the garden as a sleek black car pulled silently into the driveway below, 3 men in dark suits emerging with purposeful strides. Sophie didn't need criminal connections to recognize the silent threat they represented. The Rizzi family, Ethan said quietly, following her gaze to the new arrivals. Our main business rivals in Brooklyn, and they're not here for the celebration. My father's birthday always brings out those testing our defenses. Sophie suddenly understood the precarious position she occupied. A civilian accidentally thrust into a dangerous world of rival families and old vendettas. I should go, she whispered urgently, already calculating the quickest route to the service entrance. Ethan's hand caught her wrist, his grip firm but not painful as he stepped closer. You can't leave now, he said, voice dropping to a near whisper. The Rizzis have informants everywhere, including catering staff. If they learn about your connection to my family, you'll become a target. The garden door opened as the patriarch stepped outside, accompanied by 2 bodyguards who positioned themselves discreetly among the topiaries. His weathered face looked grim in the moonlight as he approached Sophie and his son. They know, he said without preamble, his accent thickening with evident concern. Someone recognized the girl and made a call. Nico Rizzi is asking questions about the Ferraro granddaughter who speaks the old dialect. Sophie's knees nearly buckled as the full danger of her situation became clear. Her language skills and family connection had just made her a pawn in a game she didn't understand. My grandmother, she gasped, sudden terror gripping her chest. If they know about me, they might go after her. Ethan was already on his phone, barking orders as he kept one protective hand on Sophie's back. Security team to Brighton Beach, elderly woman. Possible target, he commanded, then rattled off her grandmother's address with disturbing accuracy. The patriarch clasped Sophie's cold hands between his warm ones, his eyes filled with a strange mix of guilt and determination. We promised your great-grandfather we would protect his bloodline if the families ever reconnected, he said solemnly. Tonight, that promise is activated. A sudden commotion erupted near the main entrance of the mansion, raised voices followed by the unmistakable sound of breaking glass and a woman's frightened scream. The bodyguards immediately closed ranks around the patriarch, while Ethan pulled Sophie behind a stone pillar. Your grandmother is secure, Ethan murmured, checking a text message while keeping Sophie shielded behind his body. My men moved her to our medical facility in Manhattan, where she'll receive better care than any hospital could provide. Dawn broke over Brooklyn as Ethan's sleek black Audi pulled up to a converted warehouse near the waterfront. Sophie hadn't been allowed to return home, or even collect her belongings. The threat from the Rizzi family had escalated from theoretical to immediate during the chaotic night. This is one of our safe houses, Ethan explained as he guided her through a nondescript service entrance. Few people know about it, and those who do are absolutely loyal. You'll be protected here. The industrial exterior gave way to a stunning loft apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the East River, security glass that Sophie suspected could withstand a small explosion. The contrast between the rough neighborhood outside and the luxury within was jarring. Sophie sank onto a leather sofa, emotional and physical exhaustion finally overtaking her as the adrenaline of the night wore off. I don't understand why the Rizzi family would care about me, she said, rubbing her temples where a headache was beginning to form. Ethan moved to a hidden panel in the wall, revealing a state-of-the-art security system that he quickly armed before joining her. Because the Ferraros weren't just any Sicilian family, he explained patiently. Before the war, they controlled the most valuable shipping routes between Sicily and New York. Sophie stared at him in disbelief. trying to reconcile this information with memories of her sweet grandmother teaching her to make cannoli in their tiny kitchen. "That's impossible," she protested weakly. "My grandmother lived in a small apartment in Brighton Beach, barely making ends meet." "Because Elisabetta Ferraro walked away from that life," Ethan replied, loosening his tie as he sat across from her. "She chose love over power, your American grandfather over her family obligations. Not everyone approved of her choice." Morning light filtered through the windows as a knock at the door announced the arrival of breakfast, and, more importantly to Sophie, clean clothes. A kind-faced older woman introduced herself as Rosa, apparently the housekeeper who managed Ethan's various properties. "You look just like your grandmother when she was young," Rosa remarked, as she set down a tray of coffee and pastries. "I recognized you immediately at the party, even before you spoke the old dialect. The Ferraro eyes don't change through generations." Sophie accepted the coffee gratefully, the rich aroma momentarily grounding her in something normal amidst the surreal situation. "How do you know my grandmother?" she asked, noticing how Rosa and Ethan exchanged a significant look. "Rosa was my mother's closest friend," Ethan explained, an unexpected softness entering his voice. "And before that, she was your grandmother's childhood friend in Sicily. When we realized who you were, Rosa confirmed it." Rosa patted Sophie's hand affectionately before discreetly withdrawing, leaving her alone with Ethan once more. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and complications that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. "Why am I really here, Ethan?" Sophie finally asked, setting down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "Not just for protection. You could have assigned guards without personally bringing me to your private safe house." A faint smile touched his lips as he leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "Smart girl," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "You're here because I need to determine if you're an asset or a liability to my family." The brutal honesty was almost refreshing after a night of cryptic half-truths. "And if I'm a liability?" Sophie challenged, meeting his gaze directly despite the flutter of fear in her stomach. "What happens then?" "Then I would ensure you and your grandmother disappear safely to a new life far from New York," Ethan replied without hesitation. "Contrary to what you might believe, I don't harm innocent people, especially those with connections to my family." 3 weeks passed in the strange limbo of Ethan's safe house, Sophie's world shrinking to daily visits with her grandmother at the private medical facility and long evenings in the waterfront loft. Her previous life, the diner job, her community college classes, seemed impossibly distant. Rosa became Sophie's unexpected ally, sharing stories about Sicily that filled in the blanks of her family history, while teaching her traditional recipes that her grandmother had simplified for American kitchens. "Your hands remember the old ways," Rosa observed approvingly. The sound of the security system disarming announced Ethan's return each evening, his dangerous reputation increasingly difficult to reconcile with the man who brought gelato from her grandmother's favorite shop or sat patiently explaining complex chess strategies when she couldn't sleep. The Ferraro and Cavallari families were once partners, not rivals, Ethan explained one evening as they shared dinner on the rooftop terrace. "Your great-grandfather Giovanni and my grandfather Salvatore built their import business together after immigrating to America in the 1920s. Sophie twirled pasta around her fork, processing this new information about her family's past. "But something happened to make them enemies?" she prompted, beginning to understand that her present danger was rooted in decades-old conflicts. Ethan's expression darkened as he refilled their wine glasses, the city lights creating a glittering backdrop behind him. "The business partnership ended when the Rizzi family orchestrated a warehouse explosion that killed your great-uncle and my grandfather's brother, the man your grandmother was to marry." The pieces of the puzzle were finally connecting, revealing a complex tapestry of business rivalries, family tragedies, and broken alliances that had somehow culminated in her serving drinks at a birthday party. "And now the Rizzis think I represent a reunion of the Ferraro and Cavallari interests," she concluded. A genuine smile briefly transformed Ethan's usually guarded expression. "You catch on quickly," he observed, studying her with evident approval. "That's exactly what they fear. Our families reconciling and reclaiming our combined territory, which would threaten their control of the Brooklyn docks." Sophie set down her fork, appetite suddenly diminished by the weight of history pressing in from all sides. "But I'm just one person. I don't control any territory or have any power. My grandmother left that world behind decades ago. Power takes many forms," Ethan replied cryptically, his dark eyes reflecting the city lights. "The old families respect bloodlines and historical claims. Your very existence represents a potential shift in alliances that has everyone nervous. Sophie gazed across the Manhattan skyline, the weight of generational expectations settling on her shoulders like an invisible cloak. She thought of her college textbooks gathering dust in her abandoned apartment, the business degree she'd been pursuing to help her grandmother's small bakery, never imagining it would prepare her for managing a shipping empire. "There's a ceremony," Ethan explained, his voice softening as he refilled their glasses. "An old Sicilian tradition, when bloodlines reconnect after being severed by tragedy. My father believes observing these customs will strengthen our position with the other families and protect you more effectively than any security detail." The elaborate ritual he described, involving blessed wine, ancient oaths spoken in dialect so old few could still understand them, and the exchange of family heirlooms, seemed to belong in a historical novel rather than modern Brooklyn. Yet Sophie had seen enough in recent weeks to understand that these traditions carried genuine power in their world. Her fingers unconsciously traced the small gold medallion she'd worn since childhood, a gift from her grandmother that bore a curious crest she'd never recognized. Ethan's eyes followed the movement, recognition flaring in his expression as he gently took her hand to examine the medallion more closely. "The Ferraro family symbol," he confirmed quietly. "Your grandmother never truly left her past behind." The door to the rooftop terrace burst open as one of Ethan's security team emerged, his expression urgent. "We have a situation, boss," he reported tersely. "Someone accessed the hospital security system. They've located the grandmother's room." Sophie was already on her feet, heart hammering against her ribs, as Ethan issued rapid-fire orders into his phone. "Get the car," he commanded the security guard, then turned to Sophie with surprising gentleness. "We'll reach her in time, I promise." The hospital corridor stretched endlessly before them, as they raced toward the private wing where her grandmother had been recovering. Sophie's mind filled with horrible possibilities, her sweet grandmother caught in the crossfire of a vendetta that predated her birth. When they finally reached the room, Sophie nearly collapsed with relief at the sight of her grandmother sitting calmly in bed, working on a crossword puzzle while 2 armed guards stood vigilant at her door. The attack had been thwarted before it began. "Someone leaked her location," Ethan growled, his voice deadly quiet as he studied the security footage on his tablet. His fingers moved rapidly across the screen, rewinding and advancing through various camera angles from the hospital corridors. Sophie sat beside her grandmother, their hands intertwined as the elderly woman dozed peacefully, unaware of how close danger had come. The attempted breach had shaken Sophie to her core, transforming abstract threats into terrifying reality. "There," Ethan said suddenly, freezing the footage on a frame showing a familiar face entering a restricted security area. "Carlo Bernardi, my cousin and our family's accountant. He's been with us for 15 years. The betrayal struck deeper because Sophie had met Carlo at several family gatherings over the past weeks, finding him charming and seemingly devoted to the Cavallari business. He had even brought flowers for her grandmother during a hospital visit. "Why would your own cousin work with the Rizzis?" Sophie asked, struggling to understand the complex web of loyalties and betrayals surrounding her. "He seemed genuinely committed to your family's interests." Ethan's expression hardened into something cold and calculating that reminded Sophie sharply of his reputation. "Money, most likely," he replied, already typing rapid instructions to his security team. "Or perhaps leverage. The Rizzis may have something on him." 6 hours later, Sophie watched from behind one-way glass as Ethan confronted his cousin in a sparse interrogation room beneath the warehouse. Carlo's designer suit was rumpled, his previous confidence replaced by naked fear as he faced the consequences of his treachery. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt," Carlo stammered, sweat beading on his forehead despite the room's cool temperature. "They just wanted information about the girl, why she matters so much to your father." Sophie's stomach twisted as she realized how thoroughly her presence had destabilized the delicate balance of power in Brooklyn's criminal hierarchy. Lives were now at risk because of connections she hadn't known existed a month ago. Ethan remained unnervingly calm as he circled his cousin, hands clasped behind his back in a posture that somehow made him appear more dangerous than any obvious threat could have. "You accessed private medical records, disabled security protocols, and sold the information to Nico Rizzi." Carlo's eyes darted desperately around the room, seeking escape or mercy where none existed. "The Ferraro girl is just a waitress," he protested, voice rising in panic. "Why risk everything over someone with no real connection to our business?" "That's where you're wrong," Ethan replied softly, sliding a document across the table, a DNA test comparing Sophie's genetic markers with those of the Ferraro bloodline. She's the last direct descendant of Giovanni Ferraro's eldest daughter. The revelation sent a chill down Carlo's spine as he stared at the document, understanding dawning on his face. The Ferraro bloodline wasn't just respected, it was revered among the old families for their innovation in creating untraceable shipping routes during Prohibition, routes that had made fortunes and cemented power for generations. She has the Ferraro ledger, Ethan continued, his voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow filling the entire room. Her grandmother entrusted it to her before we moved them to safety. Coordinates, contacts, and codes that haven't been used in decades, but remain valid. Carlo's face drained of color at the mention of the legendary ledger, a book whispered about in criminal circles but believed lost during the post-war chaos. If the Rizzis knew of its existence, they would stop at nothing to possess it, explaining their increasingly desperate attempts to reach Sophie. Sophie watched through the glass, her mind reeling with questions about this ledger she supposedly possessed. Her grandmother had given her an old, leather-bound book, filled with what appeared to be poetry and recipes, insisting she keep it close. Could that ordinary family heirloom be what these dangerous men coveted? Sophie pressed her hand against the glass, shocked by this revelation and its apparent significance. No one had mentioned taking her DNA, though she recalled a doctor at the medical facility swabbing her cheek during what she'd thought was a routine examination. The Ferraro territories legally passed to her. Ethan continued implacably, tapping the document with one finger. Territories that have been managed by the Rizzi family since her grandmother left Sicily. Managed, but never owned. Carlo's expression transformed from fear to calculation as he processed this information, clearly reassessing his position in light of these new revelations. If I help you secure those territories against Rizzi interference, perhaps my indiscretion could be forgiven. The family patriarch entered the interrogation room with surprising agility for his age, his weathered face set in lines of profound disappointment as he regarded his nephew. Family loyalty cannot be bargained for, Carlo, he said heavily. It exists, or it does not. 2 months after her accidental entry into the Cavallari world, Sophie found herself standing beside Ethan on the Brooklyn docks, watching dawn break over Manhattan's skyline. Workers unloaded shipping containers under the watchful eyes of security personnel, bearing the Cavallari crest. My father has transferred control of all Ferraro assets to your name, Ethan explained, handing her a leather portfolio containing legal documents with official seals. It's your birthright, though what you choose to do with it is entirely your decision. Sophie leafed through the papers with trembling fingers, overwhelmed by the implications of owning shipping routes, warehouses, and import licenses worth millions. Her simple life had vanished like morning mist, replaced by responsibilities she never sought. The Rizzis won't accept this, she said quietly, instinctively understanding that signing these documents would make her a permanent target. They've controlled these assets for decades. They won't simply walk away because of paperwork. Ethan's shoulder brushed against hers as they stood watching the harbor activity, the casual contact sending unexpected warmth through her, despite the gravity of their conversation. No, they won't, he agreed grimly, which is why today's meeting is so crucial. For weeks, Ethan had been negotiating a sit-down with Nico Rizzi, the volatile heir to the rival family's empire. The meeting would take place on neutral territory, a renovated church converted to a restaurant in Brooklyn's historic district, with representatives from all 5 borough families as witnesses. Remember what we discussed, Ethan murmured as they walked toward the waiting car. Show no fear, make no apologies for claiming what's rightfully yours, and never turn your back on Nico. He's unpredictable even by our standards. The restaurant's private dining room hummed with tense conversation that abruptly ceased when Sophie entered on Ethan's arm. 12 men rose from their seats, expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility as they assessed the woman at the center of the brewing conflict. Nico Rizzi sat at the far end of the table, a man in his 40s with cold eyes and a surgically precise smile that never reached them. So, this is the waitress who speaks Sicilian, he remarked in English, deliberately ignoring protocol by not standing. Hardly seems worth disturbing decades of peaceful business arrangements. Sophie straightened her spine, channeling her grandmother's quiet dignity as Ethan guided her to her seat. I didn't choose my bloodline, Mr. Rizzi, she replied evenly, meeting his gaze without flinching. Just as I didn't choose to become a target for your men. The meeting deteriorated rapidly after preliminary courtesies were exchanged, Nico's veneer of civility cracking as documents were presented establishing Sophie's claim to the Ferraro assets. His face flushed with anger as he slammed his fist against the polished table. "This is nothing but a power grab by the Cavallaris," Nico shouted, ignoring the mediating attempts of the other family representatives. Using some waitress with convenient Sicilian language skills to reclaim territory they lost fair and square decades ago. Sophie felt Ethan tense beside her, his hand moving subtly toward his jacket where she knew he carried a weapon. The room's atmosphere shifted dangerously as bodyguards along the walls straightened to attention, hands hovering near concealed firearms. "I propose a compromise," Sophie said clearly, her voice cutting through the growing tension. All eyes turned to her in surprise, including Ethan's, as she had deviated from their carefully planned strategy. "A business partnership between our families. Equal management, equal profits." Nico's expression wavered between suspicion and calculation as he considered her unexpected offer. "Why would you share what you claim is legally yours?" he asked, eyes narrowed as he sought the trap. "Especially with someone you believe ordered an attack on your grandmother." Before Sophie could respond, the restaurant's doors burst open, and armed men flooded the room, their weapons trained not on the Cavallari contingent, but on Nico Rizzi himself. Federal agents in bulletproof vests moved with practiced efficiency, securing exits and disarming bodyguards. "Nico Rizzi, you're under arrest for conspiracy, racketeering, and attempted murder," announced a severe-looking woman in an FBI windbreaker, producing a warrant as her team secured the stunned crime boss. "We have recorded evidence of your orders regarding Elisabetta Ferraro." 1 year later, Sophie stood in the gleaming headquarters of Ferraro Cavallari Imports, watching ships move across the harbor from her corner office window. The merger of the two family businesses had transformed their operations, legitimizing previously shadowy enterprises into a respected international shipping corporation. Her grandmother sat in a comfortable chair nearby. Her health improved dramatically once she'd been moved to the penthouse apartment she now shared with Sophie. The old woman's eyes sparkled with pride as she watched her granddaughter navigate her new role with confidence. "Your great-grandfather would be proud," she remarked in Sicilian, her accent still perfect despite decades in America. "You've brought the family business back to its original purpose, legitimate trade between our two homelands." The office door opened as Ethan entered, his customary black suit replaced by a more approachable charcoal gray that still managed to convey authority. The past year had softened some of his harder edges, though Sophie knew he still maintained the connections and influence that kept their business operations running smoothly. "The Tokyo contracts are finalized," he announced, dropping a folder on Sophie's desk before leaning down to kiss her grandmother's cheek affectionately. "And your doctors have approved that trip to Sicily you've been planning." Sophie's heart swelled as she watched this interaction, remembering how Ethan had initially intimidated her grandmother before gradually winning her over with respectful attention and genuine interest in her stories about Sicily. Their unlikely friendship had been the first sign that her worlds could successfully merge. "The old village hasn't changed much, according to my contacts," Ethan continued, moving to stand beside Sophie at the window. "Your grandmother's family home has been restored, ready for your visit next month." The Rizzi trial had exposed decades of corruption and violence, clearing the path for the Ferraro Cavallari partnership to establish new, legitimate business practices. Sophie had testified about the attack on her grandmother, her clear testimony helping secure convictions against Nico and his top lieutenants. "I never thought I'd be grateful for speaking to a stranger in Sicilian dialect," Sophie mused, unconsciously leaning into Ethan's solid presence beside her. One moment of recognition changed everything. Ethan's arm slipped around her waist, a gesture that still sent electricity through her, despite the year they'd spent gradually transforming from reluctant allies to business partners to something much more personal. "Some would call it fate," he suggested, the hint of a smile softening his features. Outside their office window, a vintage wooden sailing vessel, painstakingly restored over the past year, glided into the harbor, its polished deck gleaming in the sunlight. The ship bore the combined Ferraro Cavallari crest on its sail, a wedding gift from Ethan's father that symbolized their family's seafaring heritage, restored to its honorable origins. The Sicilian Renaissance Project, Sophie's brainchild launched 6 months ago, had already created legitimate jobs for dozens of at-risk youth from Brooklyn neighborhoods once controlled through intimidation. Her grandmother's recipes, now produced in a commercial kitchen staffed by these same young people, were appearing on specialty grocery shelves across New York. "The governor's office called this morning," Ethan mentioned casually, though Sophie detected the pride in his voice. They want us to head the Commission on Harbor Revitalization. Apparently our reputation for transforming family businesses has made quite an impression in Albany. Sophie leaned into his solid presence, still amazed by how completely her life had changed in a single year, from struggling waitress to respected business leader, from hiding her heritage to embracing it fully. The language that had once endangered her had become her greatest asset, bridging cultures and healing wounds that had festered for generations. Sophie's grandmother cleared her throat meaningfully, rising from her chair with a knowing smile. "I'll leave you two to discuss business," she said, the twinkle in her eye making it clear she didn't believe business was on their agenda at all. "Remember, we're expected at Little Italy for dinner with your father tonight." When the door closed behind her grandmother, Ethan turned Sophie to face him fully, his expression uncharacteristically nervous. "I've been carrying this for weeks," he admitted, producing a small velvet box from his pocket, "waiting for the right moment, which never seems to come in our chaotic lives." Sophie's breath caught as he opened the box, revealing a vintage platinum ring with an emerald surrounded by diamonds. Elegant, unique, and nothing like the ostentatious jewelry that adorned the fingers of most mafia wives. "This belonged to my grandmother," he explained softly. The emerald caught the morning light, casting verdant reflections across Sophie's face as she studied its intricate setting. The stone had been mined in Sicily and carried to America by Ethan's grandfather as his only valuable possession, a talisman of hope during desperate times that eventually became a symbol of his success in the new world. "My father told me this ring has never been offered to anyone outside our bloodline," Ethan explained, something vulnerable flickering across his usually guarded expression. "It was waiting for the day our families could truly heal the rift that tragedy created decades ago." Sophie traced the vintage filigree work with trembling fingers, recognizing patterns similar to those etched into her grandmother's old silver hairbrush, Sicilian craftsmanship that connected their families across time and oceans. This was more than a proposal. It was the fulfillment of a promise made before either of them was born. Around them, the harbor sounds faded to a distant murmur as the weight of history and possibility settled between them. Two people born into separate worlds that had once been one, now standing at the threshold of reunification that their ancestors had dreamed about but never lived to see. "The families truly united," Sophie whispered, understanding the symbolic weight of this heirloom being offered to her. The blood oath between Ferraros and Cavallaris would be fulfilled not through business contracts, but through marriage, a genuine union rather than a strategic alliance. Ethan knelt before her, surprising Sophie with this traditional gesture from a man who typically disregarded convention. "Sophie Bennett," he said, his voice rough with emotion rarely displayed. "Will you build this new life with me, away from the shadows our families once lived in?" Tears blurred Sophie's vision as she nodded, extending her trembling left hand. "Yes," she whispered, as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "From serving drinks at your father's party to this, who could have predicted it?" The Brooklyn skyline stretched before them as Ethan pulled her into his arms, their silhouettes framed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the office where they'd created something neither family could have achieved alone, a future unburdened by the sins of the past, built on honesty instead of fear. Thank you all for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video, as your support is crucial for me to continue creating content like this. Your encouragement means everything,